Welcome everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name's Jay Puckett. I'm a senior partner with Boston Consulting Group. I lead our global education practice and our large-scale upskilling business called BCGU. And we have a great panel today. I'm going to just provide a quick intro to who you have in front of you in case you can't see it on the screen here. But we have Jill Buban. And Jill is the VP and General Manager of Bright Horizons EdAssist. We have Jen Buchanan from Walmart. Jen is the Vice President of Operations and Supply Chain Academy Leader. We have Aaron Rasmussen, and Aaron is the CEO of Outlier.org, but before that he was the co-founder of Masterclass. Welcome, Aaron. Allison Salisbury. Allison is an SVP of Partner Solutions for Guild. And then lastly, we have Michelle Westfort, who is the Chief University Learning Officer for InStride. So a terrific panel, and looking forward to the dialogue with this group. I've gotten to know a number of them over the last month through some conversations, and they're just a terrific group to represent this topic. And so before we get started with our first round of questions, I'll just introduce the topic, which is that employers are a fourth pillar of education. And if you think about three pillars, K-12 education, higher ed education, and TVET education, employers have felt the need, and in fact, a greater sense of urgency in recent years to step in a more significant way into the education value chain, both from a pre-employment perspective, but also very importantly from a lifelong learning, an educational access, and an upskilling perspective. And so we have today a number of people who serve this space and have actually served as innovative intermediaries that serve lots of employers. And then we also have an employer represented here in Walmart, a very large employer. And then each of you, are part of an organization where you're an employer in addition to being an intermediary. And so we're going to start with, as we talked, there was some discussion about whether the first three pillars have actually failed in their remit and therefore employers had to step in, or whether a better framing is that the world has just evolved and it's created gaps and therefore employers have stepped in to fill those gaps. But whatever framing you use, there's a problem statement that we have here. And so I'm just going to start maybe with Allison. And just say you've had experience working with both higher education and with employers in the work that you do with Guild. What do you see as the problem statement?
All right, I get to go first. The problem statement, so let's see, I'd say maybe three things. The first, I would say, is there are about 100 million people in this country that need to be reskilled in the next decade to be prepared for future jobs. And that is a huge deal for society. It's a huge deal for employers, and it's a big motivating factor to think about scale. The second thing I'd say is of the hundreds of thousands of learners that we've served over the years, when we study why they're going back to school, why they're going into skilling programs of all shapes and sizes, over 85% of them say the reason is career advancement. And so the imperative, especially for lower opportunity populations, to tie education and skilling to career, I think is sort of speaks for itself in terms of the role the employer plays in the broader ecosystem. And then the last thing I'd say, less from my hat at Guild and more from first half of my career was within higher ed institutions. The fact that they change slowly in response to labor market demand is actually a feature, not a bug. They weren't designed actually to be at the behest of individual employers. And now that the half-life of skills is declining rapidly, we actually need a lot more dynamism in the relationship and the signals going between employers, what they need, their future talent requests, as well as then how the learning community more broadly, higher ed institutions, but also training providers and vocational providers are adapting and responding to those skill-based needs. So creating clear signal and doing so with a lot more feedback loops, I think is pretty core to the role that employers play in solving the problem.
Great, thanks. Any comments on the feature versus bug comment for higher ed from the rest of the panel?
Oh, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, universities and higher ed institutions have, lasted for 1,000 years at this point. Well, I guess maybe 900 with Oxford. And it is a feature, not a bug. And unfortunately, sometimes features don't make as much sense as the environment changes. And I think that's what we're seeing in two specific areas with higher education. One is in the actual half-life of skills and the content that you're learning, but also in just the cost. When the cost is fundamentally different, it means something different to not be responsive to employer needs. Now, employment's not the only reason to get a broad education. I'm a big believer in the liberal arts and this sort of thing. Odd to be saying that, maybe in some of the circumstances here, but it's very hard to justify if the investment in that education is too high. So when you have one aspect of the university system remaining, I was going to say stagnant, but really as intended with a bit of inertia, but you have the cost changing dynamically, that's where I think we're really seeing the problem.
Yeah, interesting. So you mentioned, Aaron, the costs. Joe, when you and I spoke, we talked a little bit about, the cost associated with, how the fourth pillar, should think about bearing that cost. And maybe you could comment a little bit on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. And hi, everyone. Great to see so many people here. I think we're at an interesting point. We talk about the high costs of education, but then we're also, many of us on stage are asking our partners to look at the costs of their degree for a frontline worker and do this no-cost option or around the 5250 rule. So we're asking for high-quality education, high-quality learning supports, but to decrease their annual costs of a degree to 5250. So I think who's bearing the burden of the costs of higher education? Many of these large online adult learning providers that are the best of the best for the workforce are now starting to bear these heavy burdens in supporting the working learner, where I think that cost trajectory is going up in the smaller traditional liberal arts colleges. And when I think of the bug, not a feature, I feel like we all play a very strong role in trying to figure out how to bridge those gaps and the conversations between higher ed and corporate America, and helping higher ed institutions understand the climate, helping corporate America understand how hard it is to bend to 5250, and how there's features to looking more broadly in terms of cost structure. So there's a lot to unpack there, but it just seems like these schools that do so much for, my background's adult learning, for 40, 60 years plus, are just bending and bending and bending while supporting the working learner, where that trajectory of other institutions just continues to go up.
I might jump in, like
ahead,
Jill. When you raise the 5250 thing, it's like such a real ceiling, but it's an artificial one, right?
Yeah.
That we recognize. And what would that 5250 look like if it wasn't there? Like, what if the government changed it to 6,500 or so? Like that number hasn't changed in too long. So when we think about the cost, is it actually that artificial ceiling? We deal with it every day, but I wonder
Absolutely.
what that would mean if all of us got together and said, these things are actually barriers to success for our learners, for our employees, for everyone at large. And we've sort of created it. We've come to it, but we've sort of created the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, Jen, maybe we'll turn to you as a representative of, of Walmart, such a large employer. And maybe you could just comment on what you've heard so far and why you think it's important for employers to come in as the fourth pillar.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just think all of us sitting here together is the first step in having these conversations, but it's an exciting conversation about pulling the thread, right, and connecting the work closer to the learning and seeing employers step up to fill that gap when some of the more traditional methods of learning are not stepping in there. So I think that's really exciting work, and at Walmart, we're constantly reimagining what it means to be a learning organization, iterating on our programs, and then working in partnership with Guild on how do we remove those barriers for adult learners and how do we provide the best programs for those adult working learners.
No, great comments. I mean, as in thinking about this as we served education systems around the world, and if you think about historically education as a foundational part of all of our lives, that we all went through our own education, and many of us, I think if you look back to prior generations, that was all the education you really got, and then you launched off into your career. And if you think about the half-life of skills, I think that you mentioned, and just the changing nature of what it means to have a career today, it does seem that the investment mix has shifted from government, basically footing the bill to, the burden maybe falling to individuals for a period, and now employers seem to be stepping in. I'm just curious how y'all think about, where that's going to evolve over time. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, roughly 30% of our client base is healthcare. So when I look at that, the talent shortage is not going away in many different sectors. So I know we're reading that. I think Allison posted in the last couple of weeks some brilliant things on LinkedIn around we're reading about the talent shortage, but in so many areas, or we're reading about layoffs, but the talent shortage is still so real. So I know our clients are stepping up and saying, how do we attract talent? How do we retain talent? How do we upskill maybe exhausted nurses into administration positions so they can continue their career with us and contribute to our culture of our organization. So I don't think, for many of the clients that we work with, whether it be banking or healthcare, that their contributions are going away. They're looking for more innovative solutions. To your point, like working with the Guild or InStride or us to look for those solutions and rely on their partner to say, what's next? How do I attract the workforce of tomorrow? How do I retain my current workforce through innovative learning opportunities? And so I don't know what's beyond that, but I don't think there's going to become a time in many workforce sectors that there's not going to be contributions, because there's always going to be this need to be smarter, better, faster, and have the talent you need to succeed in the workplace.
There's two things I'd say that I think are that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. One is the volume of learners that we actually see in high school completion, in English language learning, in digital literacy, and what we call foundational learning. And so I think oftentimes when we center on the role of employer in the conversation, even I kind of led with the higher ed frame, it's where a lot of our minds go. It's where a lot of the entrepreneurial activity is around the professional populations. And the reality is where those 100 million I mentioned, so many of them actually need those foundational learning experiences, not to mention the trust, the confidence, the self-belief to then go pursue work beyond the entry level and frontline once they've built those foundational skills. So when we just look at our numbers, the sheer volume of uptake that we see there, I think is a real signal, quite frankly, that our traditional systems of education have really failed a lot of our marginalized populations, and employers are now sort of picking up that slack and then setting them on a course for upward mobility. And then the second thing that we're seeing is just in the last 2 years, a huge mix shift from mostly degrees to a mix of 50% degrees and 50% short form. And the short form market, as people who've been following it for a while, is pretty unregulated because it's for the most part unfunded by Pell. Quality outcomes are pretty suspect, and it really requires an employer to curate those programs on behalf of their employees, put the stamp of quality on them, and say that these programs are aligned to in-demand jobs, not just at my company, but other companies. You get an industry-validated certificate. Ideally, you also get credit, and it actually builds that sort of trust and credibility that I can get a fast path to the skills I need for my next job. And it's going to be a high quality program where I can port that with me. And so I think employers play a really important sort of broader role right now that I think is actually a reflection of more public failures. One, around that foundational learning, and two, around being like a quality certifier, informally or formally, around the short form programs that are really exploding in our ecosystem.
No, that's very interesting. If a couple of you mentioned, that employers and those that are serving employers, many of you are beginning to really innovate in new ways. Michelle, I know you and I spoke about innovation as a source of passion that you have, and I'm curious if you could share some ideas about where you're really seeing employers or those that are serving employers as they seek to meet these needs that we've talked about, where that's coming to mind for you.
Yeah, so I think when you start to unpack innovation, you probably need to really zoom out. And some of the things that we're seeing just more broadly are not just focused on the actual skills or the skills gap, because those continue to sort of magnify as you go in time, but really like zoom all the way back and look at sort of the groundwaters of things and recognize that it's not only an issue of, where you live and the housing that will then, be a part of the local taxes and where you go to school, when you talk about foundational, like what does our K-12 system look like? Like how are those skills truly foundational to the next step, or like really understanding how to adapt to the environment that you have? Aaron mentioned it with like liberal arts education, and if you think about what employers are wanting to teach, it's not actual skills. It's how to take a problem that they're facing and adapt to the environment around you, the way that you can communicate, the way that you can take an initiative or something and then take it to the next level. So those are the kinds of things that are harder to teach, and those are the kinds of things that we're seeing employers innovate in the future. So it's a combination of really local and also global. If you look at, some of Michael Crow's work, for instance, and ASU is, innovation hub of the world, giving access to the ability to think, the ability to be around, important strategic partnerships, the ability to take multiple realms of education, not only doing face-to-face learning environments, but hybridization of education, looking at ways to, meet learners where they are, whether it's through, stacking credentials, and Allison mentioned it like super well in the sense that employers are looking for ways that you can now embed a certificate. Ideally, if that is a 4-credit option, could that potentially lead to a degree? We know that the 100 million workers that need to be re-skilled in the US is a thing, but if you look at that number globally, it's like 375 million. So taking the problem, looking at it from a local standpoint, taking the solution to a global perspective, our employers continue to lean forward, recognize that it's not just about what I am solving for here and now in the skills today, but what I need to do to create a career pathway, a journey, so that my employees know where to go next. But then really zooming out, does it impact their children and dependents? Can we create a program where we can actually think about people's grandchildren as part of the solution? So it's not just about one element, but we're actually trying to solve for things that include, the housing issue, right? And we're including the education part of it. We're including healthcare, as you mentioned so well, Jill. The healthcare industry is one that continues to fail all of us. Education is not very different. Folks are retiring and leaving in droves because it's really hard work. So how do we come together and solve for that? And employers are innovating in ways that bring together all of these in the short form, but also in the long run of what they're trying to really achieve. And lastly, I'll say, from an innovation perspective, one of the things that is truly hurting innovation is the focus on short-term gains. And when you can't look at something from a long-term perspective, and gone are the days that we're not measuring every single aspect to it, like what's the ROI on that, and how do you, and we recognize that that's the society that we live in. However, if we're thinking about innovation, that's when we really need to start looking at things from a long-term perspective, and how do we create social impact, right? How do we create social mobility? And we know that we haven't made tremendous gains in this over the last 10 years. So I would say some corporations are really leaning in from a funding perspective. Others are innovating from like a VR and technology perspective and bringing in different ways to educate the population. And lastly, corporations are innovating because they're pushing us to bring down the costs of education. They're pushing us to ensure that we have access. And finally, to ensure that there's quality outcomes and that learners have somewhere to go with the education that they are getting.
Great. Thank you. Jill, did you want to add something?
Yeah, that was great, Michelle. And I just, I can't help but think of that, how the employer continues to be the fourth pillar in the fact of something you mentioned. We're seeing more emphasis on, I hate the term soft skills, really thinking about evergreen skills and how alongside these maybe short form credentials, are we ensuring that our workforce have those communication skills, writing skills, and what are we doing there? Because by providing those, it's being inclusive of the company's culture, and it's looking at the long-term gains of the company, and that they're contributing in the long term, not only in the job they're doing, but in the culture and the health of the overall company. And the dependent programs are such another example of that. Employers we're seeing be innovative or more innovative by looking at the next generation and looking at that talent pipeline through the generations of the current workforce. So it's really interesting when we start to connect all the dots between this conversation and thinking about how employers are, moving forward and being innovative.
Yeah, and I'd
Go
love
ahead.
to kind of illustrate it and bring it to life in the Walmart sense. So, at Walmart, we're, looking at how can we help democratize education and how can we make it accessible and careers accessible for everyone. Through our Live Better U program, our field population is eligible on day one for tuition free and debt avoidance, books for free, education, and that's in our partnership with Guild that we offer that to our associates. But I think when you really see it come to life is through a story and someone that actually went through that. And it makes me think of a recent store tour I was doing. We have an associate, Jaren Roberts, and she started with the company 12 years ago in New Roads, Louisiana. And when she started with the company, she had just graduated high school. And she wanted to get a psychology degree. And she had multiple times tried to go to school, had started and stopped, but the cost was prohibitive and there was other things at life that prohibited it from happening. In 2019, she enrolled in our Live Better U program, and she was able to take the credits that she earned, and then had already earned, and then within 2 years, complete a degree at Bellevue University. And she's now working at our home office in Bentonville as an analyst in the non-traditional talent program. So it's just really cool to hear everything that you all are talking about, and then see that come to life in the corporate world.
No, it's great, and it's great to have a specific, tangible example of a person and how it changes their life, and the types of things that you're trying to do at scale with so many lives at Walmart. Aaron, maybe we could turn to you for a second. I mean, you're a multi-time entrepreneur. I mean, this is, I would say, a space where employers are trying to be entrepreneurial and innovative. Do you have any either tidbits that you can share with us about, places where you've seen particular entrepreneurship or innovation take root?
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that employers are in the space, I think, is causing a ton of innovation. So, I grew up in rural Oregon, and one very reasonable way to get a college education was to go fight in Iraq for 4 years, come back, use your GI Bill. So, I was one of 4 people in my class, I think, to get a 4-year degree. And what I love now is with employers in the space, you could literally go get a job at Walmart and start on your degree immediately. So just that innovation itself is helping extend opportunity of even traditional education. Even if you change nothing about it, it's just another funding source for students and providing that opportunity. Now, why I kind of like the 5250 tax break, or however you want to call it, is it provides an interesting pressure and additional funding source for innovation. As we were talking about, universities, it's a feature that they don't respond quickly. Well, we actually worked with Golden Gate University, President David Fike is here, to make an associate's degree that costs $4,470 a year. The goal was to come under the $5,250 limit. And that's a hard thing to do. The only way you can do it is through innovating on the delivery of education itself. You can no longer just rely on kind of the sage on the stage approach, which, has been great for a long time. I mean, sage on the stage in our traditional education system put a person on the moon. That's pretty good. But we're going to need to innovate, partly because of, costs that have risen through a number of expectations around education, but also just that costs have risen because of, and this is just to go into economic theory, Baumol's cost disease, which is basically if a human hour's productivity goes up, like in the Industrial Revolution, any human hour output that doesn't have a productivity increase must cost more. Keep this in mind as AI starts to crank up. Let's just say physical goods just got a lot more valuable. So we see these natural increases because a human hour teaching students is about the same as it was several thousand years ago, right? You've got sort of a tribal leader in a tribe. And so it's not really like, I think a lot of people kind of point fingers at the universities, et cetera. It is a natural law of economics. So I love having employers as the fourth pillar because it allows for more innovative companies. So while employers might be, innovating, whether it's through a subscription, sort of all-you-can-eat approach to education for their employers, or it's through very specific, job training and skills-based education, they're also innovating in the ways that you educate themselves, whether it's by putting pressure, or I shouldn't say pressure, by providing opportunity for small players like ourselves to create new products that fit their needs, or actually figuring out education within their own company. So when I started Outlier, and this is, coming from Masterclass, and I had my own sort of set of ideas on how you could educate, et cetera, and it's very different in the university system, I actually looked at corporate training because there was no tradition to it. It was a metrics-driven environment of teaching, so whether or not you passed the test, whatever those metrics were, was what they taught to. So I found tons of innovation that we could then bring into academia and teach introductory courses using it. So when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship within corporate learning departments, I think it's really one of the most exciting ecosystems we have, not just for training and call it non-liberal arts approaches, but also in the liberal arts, also in the way we as human beings learn.
The first time I ever used VR was in a Walmart Academy, experiencing the holiday rush simulation, which, let me tell you, built some serious empathy.
Allison, let me stick with you on this one for a second. Just thinking about the ability to leverage the financial resources of the government, right, to fund part of this journey, as has been described here. That's obviously great financial leverage that the innovation has figured out a way to do, and sometimes in combination, it sounds like, with higher ed institutions too. But still, employers are making a bigger investment today than they ever have in learning. And you talk to a lot of executives, whether it's a CEO or a chief learning officer, chief human resources officer, about that investment case and when that makes sense and when it doesn't. What do you think is behind that? And can you just say a little bit about the dialogue that you have with executives in defending those cases?
Yeah, I kind of want Jen to take this one, but maybe she can do it after me.
Jen can come in after you.
Yeah, so this is one that, actually the dinner I was at last night, there was this like huge debate. It was a bunch of enterprise leaders, and we were talking about the rise of the CFO and decision making, and as a stakeholder at the table, especially in the last 2 years, especially in the sort of retail, restaurant, grocer sector in particular. And does that mean that sort of really scientific ROI has become like the core bread and butter of what you have to do to make the case? And I do think it's necessary. But it's like definitely not sufficient. And so we do see ROI play a huge role in our work. We have a whole team of people who are all like brilliant on building the model, analyzing the model, working with our partners to ingest their own data, and doing like a lot of comparison studies. It's very rigorous, et cetera, et cetera. $3 out for every dollar you put in more than pays for itself. And that's great. I think that's just table stakes today, though. I think in a world where there is no net new budget for spend on just about anything, I think that's just the starting point. And then I think beyond that, I think what is so special about investing in education and skilling and career mobility, and it really has to be the three together, is that it is both a solution for the near-term pain. How do I get people to come work for me because they want to learn and grow, and I can differentiate myself as an employer of choice? How do I get them to stay longer as a result because they see a path to opportunity and more meaningful work? And it is my long-term strategy to actually build my own talent pipelines from within for hard-to-fill roles, knowing that is becoming increasingly a zero-sum game, knowing that those talent pools are shrinking, not growing, and knowing that diversity, equity, inclusion is at the center of what a lot of employers are striving to accomplish in their workplace. And there is a lot of diversity that sits in your front lines. And I actually think, and when I talk to chief diversity officers, one of the most efficacious and exciting things they can do is think about how do you 2 or 3x the income of the people sitting in your frontline and entry populations. And you can do that in a handful of years. And I think that is that is the work that I think we can collectively do. I think that's the work that ultimately sets employers up for success. And so I think ROI is table stakes. You have to have it. I think the near-term impact to attraction and retention is huge. And I think the long-term solve to scalably and equitably fill your own roles from within is actually the thing that gets me up in the morning.
No, that's great. And so, clearly there's a financial lens, but also a social lens and a lens of just being a good employer through helping people realize their own potential, it sounds like, in the way that you describe it. Jen, would you add anything to that from a Walmart perspective?
Yeah, well, I would say it's like super exciting time to be in learning. I think there's a huge appetite for it right now in the industry. It's the business it's not just what skills do I need now, but what skills do I need for the future. But when I think about that L&D strategy, it's really about connecting the skilling strategy to how do I attract, develop, and retain talent. It's echoing what you said, just kind of in a different way. But, it's how do we bring associates in? How do we train them for the role that they have? How do we help them hone those skills and then help them get to that next role? So I like to think of it as like, an entrance role, a gateway role, and a destination role, and unlock that career mobility throughout the organization.
Oh, that's great. So we've got a little bit over 5 minutes left, and I'm going to just throw out one additional question for maybe each of you to comment for a minute or so on. But this is a good description of where we are today, but this is an evolving landscape. And as we project forward and we think about where we might be 10 years from now with the fourth pillar, where do you see it going in terms of how employers' role in education is going to change, increase, decrease? What do you see? Michelle, why don't we start with you and come this way?
Yeah, sure. So I think the future looks bright for all of us. To say that we have come a long way in this space is an understatement. And I think if you look at this panel, it's complicated work that we're doing, and across EdAssist, across Guild, across Outlier, and all of our employer partners, including Walmart, and all of those that are making meaningful impact in this world in general, have a place. And to me, it's a personal thing to think about access to good. I've come from a family where all 4 of my grandparents never had higher than a 4th grade education. So when I think about why we're here, how do we get to a place that all of society has access to education, but access to good education? That's where we should all be striving towards, and we've come a really long way in solving these things. So I would say that there's a few things that are important for us all to be doing, and those are pushing each other to do the right thing, measuring the right thing around our programs to determine what the future careers will be for individuals, and how we can actually measure what the successful learning objects look like and what those successful opportunities are in the future.
Great, thanks. Allison?
So one of my favorite bar charts, because everyone has to have a favorite, is in the 1970s, most employers' most expenses were physical goods. Today, most employers' most expenses is human capital. It's completely reversed, almost exactly. And as a result, you've seen a huge increase in investment in wages, in training, in education, in skilling, in everything under the sun. And I think that will just go up and to the right. I think we are in chapter 1 of that investment. What I hope is actually that investment gets allocated in a different way. It's mostly gone to the white-collar workforce. When you market map companies that sell into this space, when you look at L&D budgets, when you look at human capital transformation initiatives generally, they're mostly going to corporate workers. Most of the American workforce sits in frontline entry and deskless roles. Most of our talent pool is there. That is where we have an equity crisis. That is where the other pillars have fallen down. And I think it is within the interest of business and institutions and society more broadly to invest much more intensively there. And my hope is, as a result, you see this wave of innovation of organizations really built to serve that population and to do it in a way that is aligned to the needs of business and the needs of workers.
Great. Aaron?
I think we are under-guessing on the amount of reskilling that we're going to need in the next 5 years by potentially an order of magnitude. AI really is amazing. I know there's a lot of hype about it, but it also, I've started using it every day. It makes my job easier. Basis for our next 4 press releases was actually GPT-4 generated on the first draft. So I think this is an incredible time for employers to be focused on reskilling. And I think that necessarily the cost of reskilling workers or upskilling workers is going to come down. And I think that is a fantastic thing. In the next 5 years, I think we will know more about the way people learn than we have in the history of humanity. Right now, we can do things sort of better and less expensively, but we can't really do things faster. Mm-hmm. And I think that will be sort of the new frontier coming down the pike. And that's very exciting because it means that, when I think back again to my hometown and the opportunities that are there, you can choose a corporation and you know that most corporations will have excellent skilling programs, whether it's education on top of a liberal arts or what have you, and that'll really be able to push you ahead.
Great. Jen?
I'm going to be real brief because I saw our 2 minute sign. But no, I'm like really excited for the future. I think the opportunities are endless, but when I think of it from the associate point of view and the upskilling that's going to come, it's just really like the hope and the confidence that we're going to inspire in all our associates, and how they'll be able to drive forward and how we'll be able to align that to future skills. I think that's an exciting vision there. So I think there's more work ahead of us than behind us, but excited for what the future holds.
Great. Jill?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more of a shift, and this came up earlier, from the learn to earn model and the traditional, and where this path of earn to learn. We're going to normalize more people coming out of high school and feeling good about getting a job at Walmart, Home Depot, the local hospital, and have their employer pay for their education. And that's going to decrease student debt, increase productivity, increase confidence in so many people that would never have the chance to get an education, and contribute overall to society goals and to the U.S. workforce. So I think the future's bright.
Great. Well, thank you all. If you'd all just join me in thanking the panel, I thought this was terrific.